You're not welcome at this table." That's what my daughter-in-law said to me. Not in private. Not in a hushed corner of the house. She said it in front of 12 people at a dinner table set with my son's good china in the house I helped them buy. I want to tell you what happened after that. But first, let me tell you how we got there. My name is Robert. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years teaching high school history in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. Not a glamorous career, not a high-paying one either. But I loved it. I loved watching 17-year-olds suddenly care about something. The way their faces changed when they realized history wasn't just dates and dead people, but a mirror held up to right now. I coached junior varsity baseball for 22 of those years. I drove the school van to away games and stopped at Dairy Queen on the way home when we won. My wife Carol passed away 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We had 38 years together, and I'd give back every good day of my life for 39. Our son Daniel is 39 now. We raised him in that same suburb. He played baseball, not well but enthusiastically, which I always thought was the better quality anyway. He went to Ohio State, got an engineering degree, moved to Austin, Texas about 12 years ago for work, the kind of move that makes sense on paper and breaks something quiet in your chest. He met Melissa about 8 years ago. She's smart, I'll give her that. Sharp in a way that sometimes looks like intelligence and sometimes looks like something else, depending on the day. She came from money. Not old money, but the kind of family where money was the main language spoken at home. She had opinions about restaurants and neighborhoods, and the right kind of car for someone at Daniel's level, whatever that meant. I tried to like her. I genuinely did. Carol liked her, or at least said she did. Carol was always more charitable than me. She'd say, "Robert, she's just ambitious. There's nothing wrong with wanting a good life." And I'd say, "There's nothing wrong with it, unless wanting it turns you into someone who forgets to be decent." Carol would give me a look and I'd drop it. When Carol died, Daniel flew up for the funeral and stayed 10 days. That was good. That was the right thing. Melissa came for the service and flew back to Austin the next morning because of work. I didn't say anything about that. You don't say anything about that. About 14 months after Carol passed, I decided to sell the house. It was too big, too quiet, and the upkeep was getting to be more than I wanted. The house had appreciated significantly over 30 years. We bought it for $118 and it sold for $460. After paying off the remaining mortgage and closing costs, I cleared just over $300,000. Now here's where I need to be careful, because this is the part people will want to judge. I want to explain it the way it actually was, not the way it looks in hindsight. Daniel and Melissa had been renting in Austin. A nice apartment, but they'd been trying to buy for 2 years and kept getting outbid. The Austin market was brutal. They'd put in 6, 7 offers and lost every one. I knew Daniel wasn't asking me for anything. He never did, but I'd sit in my new apartment in Columbus, 2 bedrooms I didn't need, and I'd think about that $300,000 sitting in a savings account, and I'd think about what Carol would have wanted. Carol would have wanted it to go to Daniel. I know that as clearly as I know anything. So I called him one Sunday afternoon and I said I wanted to help with a down payment. He said, "No, Dad, absolutely not. Keep your money. You need it for retirement." We went back and forth for 3 phone calls over 2 weeks. Finally, I told him I was going to give him $150. Not all of it. Half. I kept $150 for myself, plus my pension from the school district and Social Security. I had done the math. I was fine. The important thing people need to understand is this. When I made that decision, I was 63 years old and healthy. My pension was $2,200 a month, Social Security, another $17. Nearly $4,000 a month, plus $150 in savings, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus where rent was $1,400. I was not being reckless. I was being a father. Daniel and Melissa bought a 4-bedroom house in a good neighborhood in Austin. I saw pictures. It was beautiful. Melissa sent me a photo of the backyard and said, "This is where we'll have Christmas." That was a nice thing to say. I held on to that. For about a year, things were good. I visited twice. They came to Columbus once. Daniel called regularly. Melissa was warmer than usual during that period. I noticed it but didn't examine it too closely. You take warmth when it's offered. Then I had a health scare. Routine checkup turned into a referral, turned into a biopsy. Prostate cancer caught early, stage 1. The oncologist was calm and reassuring. He said we'd likely treat it with radiation and monitor closely that my prognosis was excellent. And it was. Treatment went well, but treatment isn't free even with Medicare, and the 6 months of it wiped through more of my savings than I'd expected. By the end of that year, I had about $80,000 left in savings instead of $150,000. The math that had looked comfortable now looked a little tighter. I didn't tell Daniel right away how much the treatment had cost. I didn't want to worry him. Looking back, I should have been more direct. But I was 64 years old and I'd spent my whole life being the one who handled things, and you don't just stop being that person overnight. Over the next 2 years, I noticed something shifting with Daniel and Melissa. The calls got shorter. When I visited Austin, Melissa always seemed to have somewhere to be. There was a guest room in their house and I stayed there. But I felt like a guest in the formal sense. Like someone who needed to be managed and moved through the schedule without disrupting it. My granddaughter Sophie was born 2.5 years ago. She's the best thing that's happened in a long time. But even Sophie became something complicated. Melissa had very specific ideas about childcare and visitors and schedules. I was welcome to visit, but visits needed to be planned 2 weeks in advance, couldn't exceed 5 days. And there was a list, actually a written list of things I wasn't supposed to do or say around the baby. I read that list twice and then folded it up and put it in my pocket and didn't say a word because Sophie was worth it. But Melissa's mother, Patricia, she was there constantly. She had a key to the house. She showed up unannounced and stayed for weeks at a time. When I mentioned it to Daniel, gently, just once, he said, "Dad, she helps with Sophie. It's different." I asked how it was different. He said, "She's local. It's easier." I said, "Okay." I let it go. What I couldn't let go was what started happening around the 3rd year after they bought the house. The dynamic had shifted enough that I could feel it clearly. Melissa didn't bother softening things anymore. There were comments about my apartment being depressing, comments about the car I drove. Once when I mentioned I was watching my spending, she said, with Daniel sitting right there, "Well, that's what happens when you don't plan properly." Daniel said nothing. I drove home from that visit feeling something I hadn't felt since I was a boy. That specific loneliness of being in a room full of people who should love you and feeling like a stranger. The breaking point came at Thanksgiving. Daniel and Melissa hosted. Patricia was there, and her husband Gerald, and 2 couples who were friends of Daniel and Melissa's from their neighborhood. 12 people total, including me. It was the kind of Thanksgiving that looks perfect in photos. The table was beautiful. Melissa had spent 2 days cooking. The house smelled like everything right about the season. I'd driven down from Columbus. 14 hours. I'd left at 4 in the morning to miss traffic. I brought a pie from a bakery Carol used to love. The kind she made every year until she couldn't anymore. And I'd called ahead to ask if I could bring something, and Melissa had said, "Sure, whatever you want." I should have noticed the tone in that phrase. Whatever you want. I should have noticed the tone in that phrase. I got there at 6 in the evening. Gerald and Patricia were already there, settled in, comfortable in the way that people are comfortable in a space they've been in 100 times. The friends arrived at 7. The table was set for 12, and it was set beautifully. I found my seat and sat down. Melissa was across the table. She was talking to one of the neighbor couples, laughing about something, relaxed and bright in the way she could be when she was in her element. Daniel was in the kitchen. Sophie was with Patricia in the living room. Dinner started well enough. The food was good. Conversation moved around the table. Gerald asked about my drive. One of the neighbors, a man named Kevin, asked what I'd taught, and when I said history, he said his kid was struggling with AP history, and could he ask me a couple questions. We talked for a few minutes, and I liked Kevin. He had an easy quality about him. Then there was a lull in the conversation, one of those moments where several side conversations end at the same time and the table goes briefly quiet. And in that quiet, Melissa said it. She was looking at Daniel, not at me, but the table was small enough that everyone could hear. She said, "I told your father before he came that we'd need the guest room for Patricia and Gerald this visit." Then she turned to me, looked at me directly and said, "You can take the couch, or there's a Marriott on the highway. We just don't have the space." I hadn't been told this before I came. I want to be clear about that. No one had mentioned anything about the guest room. I had confirmed my visit 2 weeks earlier, and the guest room was where I always stayed. I said calmly, "This is the first I'm hearing about this." Melissa said, and I remember the exact words because I've replayed them many times since, Well, I assumed you'd understand that my parents are more comfortable here. You're always welcome, but there are limits to what we can accommodate. The table went quiet in a different way. Not conversational lull quiet. The kind of quiet that means everyone heard something they weren't supposed to hear and nobody knows where to look. Daniel looked at his plate. That was the moment. Not the words from Melissa. I had been building toward accepting that Melissa was who she was. It was Daniel, my son, 39 years old, a man I'd coached and driven and stayed up late with and moved $150,000 to help. Looking at his plate, I folded my napkin. I set it on the table. I looked around at the food and I said, "Thank you for having me." And I stood up. Kevin looked up. He was the first one to say anything. He said, "Robert, please sit down." His wife put her hand on his arm, but he didn't stop. He said, "I don't know the full situation here, but what was just said wasn't right." He looked at Melissa. "That wasn't right." Melissa said, "Kevin, this is a family matter." Kevin said, "I'm sitting at the table. It's not a private matter anymore." There was a long silence, long enough for Patricia to come in from the living room, having heard some of it, and stand in the doorway looking uncomfortable. And then Daniel looked up from his plate. Finally, he looked at me, still standing there with my napkin folded on the table, and something moved across his face. I've known that face for 39 years. I know every version of it. He said, "Dad, sit down, please." Not to me the way he'd been talking to me for the past 2 years. Different. Quiet, like when he was 16 and he'd done something he knew was wrong and there was no pretending otherwise. I sat down. The rest of the dinner was quiet. Melissa excused herself to the kitchen and stayed there longer than necessary. Patricia and Gerald talked softly to each other. Kevin made an effort to restart conversation and I was grateful for it. After dinner, after the guests left and Sophie was put to bed, Daniel came and sat next to me on the back porch. It was cold for Austin. I had my jacket on. He didn't start with an explanation or a defense. He just sat there for a minute looking at the dark backyard, and then he said, "I don't know how to explain the last 2 years without it sounding like a bunch of excuses." I said, "Then don't explain. Just tell me the truth." He said the truth was that he'd been letting Melissa set the tone for so long that he'd stopped noticing what the tone had become. He said there wasn't one moment he could point to, just a gradual thing. And he knew that wasn't an excuse. He was just trying to be honest. He said he'd watched tonight happen and felt sick about it, and he didn't want to be the kind of man who looked at his plate while that was going on. I asked him if he knew what it had cost me, not the money. To drive 14 hours and sit at that table and feel like I was inconveniencing everyone by existing. He said he knew. He said he was sorry. He said it the way you say it when you mean it, not as a transaction. I told him that sorry was a starting point, not a finish line. I told him that I loved him and I wasn't interested in cutting him out of my life. But I needed him to be my son, not a man who watched his father get dismissed and found something interesting to look at on his dinner plate. He nodded. He didn't argue. He just said, "Okay, Dad, okay." We sat out there until it got too cold to stay. I slept in the guest room that night. Nobody said another word about the Marriott. That was 8 months ago. Things are different now. Not fixed. I want to be honest about that. Relationships don't get fixed like a leaky faucet. They change. Sometimes slowly. But Daniel calls more now. Real calls, not the 5-minute check-in kind. He came to Columbus in March, alone, and we went to a Clippers game and ate at a diner he remembered from when he was a kid, and talked for 3 hours about things we hadn't talked about in years. Carol, baseball, what I'd actually been going through with the medical stuff. Melissa and I are polite. I don't expect warmth from her, and I don't think she expects warmth from me. But Daniel has found, I think, some version of a spine, and that has changed the geometry of things. I am invited to Christmas. I am told directly and with genuine intention. Sophie calls me Grandpa Bobby, and the last time I visited she fell asleep on my shoulder watching a cartoon, and I just sat there and didn't move for 40 minutes because I wasn't ready for it to end. I'm telling this story because I think a lot of people my age know this feeling. The slow erosion, the way you make yourself smaller so as not to inconvenience anyone. The moment you realize that making yourself smaller never actually made the room more comfortable. It just made you smaller. I gave my son money because I love him and I wanted good things for his life. I don't regret that. But I learned that generosity without a relationship is just a transaction, and you cannot buy your way into the seat you're already supposed to have. I'm 67 years old. I'm in remission. I drive a 9-year-old Honda Civic that runs fine. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment with Carol's photographs on the walls and her pie recipe in the kitchen drawer, and some weekends I make it and eat it alone, and some weekends Sophie helps me, standing on a step stool getting flour on everything. Both kinds of weekends are good. I just needed my son to show up to them. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened that Thanksgiving. Not just the moment itself, Melissa's words, the quiet table, Daniel looking at his plate, but the years that led there. Because that's the thing nobody talks about when they tell a story like this. The breaking point is never really the beginning. It's just the moment the weight finally shows itself. I made choices that left me vulnerable. I know that. Giving Daniel half of what I had from the house sale. I don't regret the love behind it, but I wasn't honest with myself about what I was trading. I told myself I was being a father. And I was. But I was also avoiding a harder conversation. The one where you say to your son, I need you to stay close. I need to matter to you. I was 50 words away from that conversation for years, and I never said them. I bought the house instead. That's on me and Daniel. I watched my son become someone I didn't recognize, not all at once, but the way a river changes a bank. So gradual you don't notice until the shape is completely different. He's a good man. I believe that. But good men make bad choices when they stop paying attention to what they're becoming, when they let someone else set the standard for who deserves their loyalty. He looked at his plate that night because looking up was going to cost him something. He knew it and he chose the cheaper option. That's not a character flaw you're born with. That's a habit. And habits can be broken. But only if the person wearing them decides they're done. What Kevin did. A neighbor, someone who owed me nothing, who had known me for exactly the length of one dinner. That has stayed with me longer than almost anything else. He spoke up because it was the right thing, and he didn't weigh it first. That's not a small thing. Most people at that table were calculating. Kevin wasn't. I've thought about that a lot. About how decency isn't really about grand gestures. It's about the 2-second window where you decide whether to open your mouth or let it go. And Kevin opened his mouth. The hardest thing I've learned at 67 is that you can't make people treat you with dignity. You can model it. You can ask for it. You can leave when it's absent, but you cannot manufacture it in someone who isn't ready to give it. What you can do is refuse to keep shrinking. Every time I made myself smaller at that table, in that guest room, on those short phone calls, I was teaching everyone around me what I'd accept. That's not wisdom. That's just erosion. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke up in the guest room and I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. No speeches, nothing cinematic. I just decided I was done adjusting myself to fit into spaces that were designed to exclude me. If there wasn't room for me at the table, I was going to build my own. Turns out Daniel wanted to sit at that table too. He just needed to remember he had the option. That's the whole story, really. Not about revenge, not about being right, about a father and a son who almost lost each other to silence and got one more chance to choose differently. We're choosing differently now. Some days it's easy. Some days it takes work. But Sophie fell asleep on my shoulder last month and Daniel was sitting right across from me watching it happen, and he looked like himself again, the boy I drove to baseball and stopped at Dairy Queen with on the way home. That's enough. That has always been enough. I just forgot for a while that I was allowed to ask for it.